Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Tonight, we're going to be talking about, did John Wilkes Booth actually kill Lincoln? And those folks that they hung, was that all of the conspirators, or was somebody left out of the bunch? Once more, I have Don Wildman to thank for giving me the idea for tonight's show. I was watching Mysteries of the Museum, and I got really wrapped up in the story about Abraham Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth. So it got me to reading and looking up different articles. And the more I read about it, the more I realized that I was putting a lot of time into reading. I might as well do a show about it. Each show takes about 10 hours of research. Then I have to record it. Then I have to do a little bit of editing if anything gets messed up. I don't do a lot of editing to the show, so if I screw up, you'll probably hear it. But if I have a guest on who makes a mistake or says something that they don't want out on the air, then I will cut that out. Well, if you read just about any history book on the United States, you'll see that John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln in Ford's Theater. Ask anybody living in the U.S. who killed Lincoln, and they'll say it was Booth. A lot of people don't even know there's a serious question as to who did the shooting and whether or not Booth died in that tobacco barn in Virginia. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. His family moved to southern Indiana in 1816. John Wilkes Booth was born on May 10, 1838, into a family of actors near Bel Air, Maryland. Lincoln didn't move to Illinois until he was 21, which makes me wonder, why is Illinois called the Land of Lincoln? You'd think that title should be to Kentucky, but, well, that's Illinois for you. John Wilkes Booth had moved to Maryland at age 18, trying to make a name for himself as an actor. He was extremely jealous of his older brother, who was also an actor, but far more successful. I'm sorry, did I say Maryland? No, he moved to New York City, trying to make a name for himself. He was born in Maryland. His brother was the actor in the family, and John was kind of following in his footsteps. No one is sure where Lincoln got his love of reading. Both of his parents were close to being illiterate. Lincoln only attended school when he had a chance. As he put it, he attended school by littles, a little now and a little then. After arriving in Illinois, Lincoln had no desire to be a farmer. Instead, he tried finding an occupation that was not quite so much labor. Farming was one of the hardest jobs out there. They didn't have tractors. You had a mule that pulled the plow, and you had to drive the mule. You had to do just about every job by hand. Well, Lincoln went to work as a rail splitter. Fences were built by splitting a tree lengthwise, then stacking them one on top the other with an angle in each corner. Just look up split rail fence to see what I mean. Still, this was a lot of hard work since everything had to be done by hand. Lincoln worked as a flat boatman, moving merchandise south along the Mississippi into New Orleans for a while. The boats had flat bottoms, so they didn't need a deep river. Instead of sails, the boats were moved by pushing long poles into the mud at the bottom and then pushing the boat along the river. Lincoln once said he didn't know much, but he knew how to read. He was mostly self-taught. Working by day and reading by night, Lincoln managed to pass the Illinois State Bar exam, and he became a lawyer. His goal was to become a state legislator. In early 1830, Lincoln joined the Whig Party. October 16, 1854, in his Peoria speech, Lincoln declared his opposition to slavery. In 1854, Lincoln was elected to the Illinois legislature, but he declined to take his seat. Lincoln instead sought election to the United States Senate. At that time, the senators were elected by the state legislators. It wasn't until Woodrow Wilson decided he wanted to take power away from the states and consolidate everything in Washington that senators became elected by the citizens. After leading in the first 6 rounds of voting, Lincoln was unable to attain a majority. He then instructed his backers to vote for Lyman Trumbull, who was a Democrat candidate. Trumbull was an anti-slavery Democrat and had received few votes in early ballots. Lincoln's decision to withdraw from the election enabled his Whig supporters and Trumbull's anti-slavery Democrats to combine and defeat the mainstream Democratic candidate. Later on, Trumbull switched parties, saying that the Democrats were just too pro-slave. John Brown was an abolitionist who believed he was on a mission from God to start a slave revolt in the United States. On Sunday night, October 16, 1859, Brown and his followers attacked the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry. They seized a bunch of weapons and took hostages. The plan was to take the weapons and distribute them amongst the slaves who would then form into an army to free others. Well, the next morning, army workers had discovered Brown's men were still at the armory, and they gave the alarm. Local militia, farmers, and shopkeepers surrounded the armory. One of the members of the Richmond militia was John Wilks Booth. The Union Army arrived under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee, and they surrounded the building where all of Brown's followers had taken shelter. After a brief battle, Brown and his few remaining followers were taken into custody, and they were transported to Richmond, Virginia by the Richmond militia, where they were hanged for murder. John Wilks Booth was one of the guards. In 1856, Lincoln severed his ties with the Whig Party, and he joined the brand new Republican Party. He said the Whig Party wasn't anti-slavery enough, and the Republican Party was. March 1857, Supreme Court Justice Roger B. Taney wrote that blacks were not citizens and derived no rights from the Constitution. This became known as the Dred Scott decision. While many of the Democrats hoped the Dred Scott would end the dispute over slavery in the territories, the decision sparked further outrage in the North. Lincoln denounced the decision, alleging it was the product of a conspiracy of Democrats to support the slave power. Lincoln argued, "The authors of the Declaration of Independence never intended to say all were equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. But they did consider all men created equal. Equal in certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Here is something you might not know. Abraham Lincoln held a patent on an invention to lift boats over shoals and obstructions in a river. It is the only United States patent ever registered to a President of the United States. Lincoln conceived the idea of inventing a mechanism that would lift a boat over shoals and obstructions when on 2 different occasions the boat on which he traveled got hung up on an obstruction. The one and only president with his own registered invention. When Lincoln began his presidential move, the power players in the South said they would leave the Union if Lincoln got elected. They knew he would take steps to end slavery throughout the entire country. I had relatives in the Civil War. They all fought on the side of the South. People think everyone in the South not only wanted slavery, but owned a few as well. The folks living in Laredo, as well as the Rio Grande Valley, voted in favor of secession not because they liked slavery, but because the Union wasn't doing anything to stop the bandit raids coming out of Mexico. Once Texas had joined the Confederacy, Captain Benavides was given command of Fort McIntosh. When a group of bandits attacked Carrizo, which is now known as Zapata, the captain gathered up his troops and followed the bandits south. They tracked them all the way to Mesquitil Lileño near Camargo, which is in Mexico. They attacked and killed many of the bandits and executed the rest on charges of murder. This bold move not only caused Captain Benavides to be promoted to colonel, but it all but ended any bandit raids into Texas anywhere near Fort McIntosh. When the Union captured Brownsville, the major shipping port for the Confederacy, Colonel Benavides contacted a group of bandits in Mexico and offered them a deal. If the bandits would escort the cotton being shipped east through Mexico to Baghdad, and then escort the arms being shipped back west, the colonel would pay the bandits and give them arms. I'll bet a lot of y'all have never heard of Baghdad, Mexico. It's a few miles east of Matamoros, right on the Gulf Coast. Gulf Coast. I don't even play golf. They call it golf because all the other 4-letter words had already been taken. Yes, Baghdad, Mexico. It's right on the Gulf Coast. The bandits had already tasted his wrath, so they agreed to help transport cotton and arms as long as the colonel wouldn't attack them anymore. The cotton was loaded onto Mexican ships and taken north to New York. There, the cotton was sold and the gold was used to buy rifles and ammunition, which was then transported back south to Baghdad. New York merchants were supplying the Confederacy with gold and arms by way of Mexican merchant ships. And since the ships were from Mexico, the United States Navy wouldn't attack them even though they knew what was going on. Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States, and South Carolina announced they were leaving the Union. They were quickly followed by Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina soon followed. Missouri and Kentucky were admitted into the Confederacy, even though they never formally announced secession. 13 states left the North to form their own country. Then all hell broke loose. President Lincoln called for his best military leader to see him in Washington. Colonel Robert E. Lee turned down the promotion to lead the Northern Army. He was from Virginia, and his alliance was to his home state. Robert E. Lee became the commanding officer of the Army of Virginia. See, back then, the United States wasn't considered one country. It was a conglomeration of several states, and each state was kind of run as if it was their own country. Many states had their own currency. They had their own postal system. So when Virginia left the United States, it was more like one country breaking away from another country. Lee never referred to the Union soldiers as being the enemy. He referred to them as those people. He also said he wished he could buy every slave and set them free to end this bloody conflict. Many folks living in the North were sympathetic to the Confederacy. They were reaping the benefits from all that slave labor, and they really didn't want slavery to go away. Textile merchants and many wealthy business owners were rooting for the South. One of these was John Wilks Booth. He very much wanted to see the South succeed. Here's a little something else a lot of people don't know. There's been a huge controversy here lately about the Confederate flag, stars and bars, as it was referred to. Slavery was being conducted using the United States flag. So you could say that the United States flag was actually the representation of the slavery. Well, during the first battle of Manassas, when the South actually won, in the North they refer to it as Bull Run. During the first battle of Manassas, both sides were using the same flag. And it led to a lot of confusion because, well, even though the southern states had broken away from the United States, they were still using the stars and stripes. Well, it was decided that the southern military needed a different flag so that their troops would know which side was theirs. And so they came up with what was known as the Confederate battle flag. That's what is being yelled and screamed about today as representing slavery, when actually it just represented the soldiers of the South. When Lincoln was elected, people said the South hated him. Well, the power brokers in the South hated him. The big plantation owners hated him. The politicians hated him. The average farmer or laborer had no real ill feelings for Lincoln. Many did hate the North, saying it was their fault the war was started in the first place. But the president was just that guy in Washington. Here's a weird little tidbit from my show, The Puppet Masters, October 2016. Leading up to the Civil War, the country had two distinct forms of Masonic lodges: the Masons of the North and the Masons of the South. The Supreme Council of the Southern Jurisdiction was founded in Charleston, South Carolina in 1801. This council was in charge of the goings-on in the states in the southern half of the country. Surprisingly, or maybe not, the states and territories in the southern jurisdiction are also the states of the Confederacy. The nation was split along the border between the two jurisdictions of Freemasons. This strikes me as just a little bit odd, but then who knows for sure? The war raged on for 4 years. During that time, 620,000 Americans died from battle-related injuries or sickness. That's more than World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. Considering just about everyone who died was an American on one side of the war or the other. In the summer of 1864, Booth began formulating plans to kidnap Abraham Lincoln. The plan called for Lincoln to be taken south to Richmond, where he would be held until in exchange for Confederate prisoners of war. Booth recruited friends and known Southern sympathizers for his mission, including the 8 persons tried before the 1865 Military Commission. Some who resisted his persuasive efforts, such as actor Samuel Chester, became key government witnesses during the trial. March 15th, Booth and most of his fellow conspirators met at a restaurant 3 blocks from Ford's Theater to plan their abduction of the president. Soon thereafter, Booth heard that the president would be attending a matinee performance of Still Waters Run Deep on March 17th at the Campbell Hospital on the outskirts of Washington. This, he decided, would be the perfect opportunity for a kidnapping, and according to John Surratt, Booth developed a plan to intercept Lincoln's carriage en route to the play. Booth's plans were foiled, however, when the president changed his plans and decided instead to speak to the 140th Indiana Regiment and present a captured flag. Booth then turned his plan to kidnapping the president at a future performance at Ford's Theater, where the actor had several friends. But the plan failed to win the support of some of his co-conspirators, who dismissed it as ill-feasible. When Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, he only surrendered the Army of Virginia. General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. It is often called the end of the American Civil War, but there were other armies out there still willing to fight. Grant allowed Lee to choose a location where they could discuss the terms of surrender. The location was next to the Appomattox Courthouse. Lee was waiting in the first-floor parlor of the house owned by Wilmer McLean. The odd thing about this location was Wilmer McLean had moved his family to the far corner of Virginia after a cannonball had hit his house during the first land battle of the Civil War at Manassas. The war had started in McLean's front yard and ended in his front room, at least this part of it. The Battle of Palmetto Ranch was the final battle of the American Civil War. It was fought May 12th and 13th, 1865, on the banks of the Rio Grande east of Brownsville, Texas, and a few miles from the seaport of Los Brazos de Santiago. That's the arms of San Diego. Union and Confederate forces in southern Texas had been observing an unofficial truce since the beginning of 1865. Union Colonel Theodore Barrett, who was newly assigned to command an all-black unit and had never been in combat, ordered an attack on the Confederate camp near Fort Brown for unknown reasons. The Union attackers captured a few prisoners, but the following day, the attack was repulsed near Palmetto Ranch by Colonel John Ford, and the battle resulted in a Union defeat. The Confederate forces of 300 managed to defeat 1,700 Federals. This was probably because the Confederate soldiers and their leaders were battle-tested, and the Union forces had seen little actual fighting, and their colonel had seen none. The Union forces had been surprised by artillery, which may have been supplied by the French army, which was occupying nearby Mexican town of Matamoros. Since the last battle of the Civil War was officially fought in May, Memorial Day is held on the last Monday of every May each year. And now you know why Memorial Day is in May. And now that the Civil War was over, it was time to rebuild the country. And of course, some wanted to get even with the Southerners. Lincoln wanted to welcome the Confederacy back into the United States without any repercussions. Many in Washington saw this as the opportunity to punish the South and make a healthy profit in the same time. Reconstruction had actually begun during the war, as Lincoln and his associates considered how to reintegrate the nation and the fates of the Confederate leaders as well as the freed slaves. Shortly after Lee's surrender, a general asked Lincoln, "How do we treat the defeated Confederates?" Lincoln replied, "Let 'em up easy." In other words, you knocked them down, now get them back on their feet, but do it carefully. Lincoln was determined to find meaning in the war once it had come to an end. He did not want to continue alienating the southern states. His main goal was to keep the Union together. He planned to go forward not by focusing on who was to blame, but on how to rebuild the nation as one. And with this, I'm going to take a brief pause and play some commercials, get my coffee consumption going. So we'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. Are you taking care of your skin, or are you going to wait and see how time treats you? Take care today by contacting Lourdes James, Independent Beauty Consultant, at 956-723-3019. Don't let time get the best of you. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical. 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Trike. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. And welcome back to the show. Booth now saw that it was his mission to avenge the Confederacy. He decided to kill Lincoln, Vice President Johnson, the Secretary of State, and possibly General Grant. Booth was well known by just about everyone who worked at Ford's Theater. He was one of the actors seen on stage on dozens of occasions. Booth slipped into the president's balcony and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. He then jumped down to the stage and yelled, "Sic semper tyrannis," meaning, "Thus always to tyrants." This is the state motto of Virginia. As he landed on the stage, Booth had twisted his right ankle, breaking the bone. He limped off stage and out to the alley where his horse was being held. With a broken leg, Booth went to see Dr. Mudd to have the bone set. He then rode south along with David Harold into Maryland, and they laid up in the swampy land just north of the Potomac River. After crossing the river into Virginia, Booth and Harold went to a farm, and they were allowed to stay in the Garrett Tobacco Barn. April 26th, the Federal troops surrounded the barn and ordered the two men to surrender. Harold came out, but Booth refused, so the troops set fire to the barn. The orders were quite specific. Booth was to be taken alive, no matter what. As the fire raged, Sergeant Boston Corbett looked through a gap in the barn side and spotted Booth. He took aim and shot him in the back of the neck. The troopers out front managed to grab Booth and drag his body from the burning structure. The body was taken to Washington for an autopsy. Oddly enough, the body did have a broken leg, only it was the left leg. Many people who were familiar with Booth said the body didn't really look like him. Now keep in mind, Booth was seen on stage by many people. A lot of the soldiers that had arrested him had watched him perform. They were very familiar with what Booth looked like, and they all said they didn't think that the body was him. Once the fire was out, the troops found Booth's book and papers in the ashes. The paper was not burned or not even scorched. In the years following these events, even some of the United States military have called into question the official events. Just after the turn of the century, John Schmucker was general counsel to the Department of the Army, and he went on record insisting that evidence supporting the conclusion that Booth was executed at Garrett Farm would not stand up to cross-examination in a court of law. When Harold exited the barn, the first thing he was reported to have said was that Booth was not in the barn. Now, this has been hotly debated for many years, After the man in the barn had been shot, Dr. John May was summoned to make an identification. Being acquainted with Booth, he looked at the body on the ground and said, "Whoever the victim was, it was not John Wilks Booth." Several witnesses went on record saying that the man inside Garrett's farm that evening had red hair. Every historical account says Booth had black hair. At some point during his flight from Ford's Theater, possibly while being treated for his broken leg, Booth may have altered his appearance by dyeing his hair. Some reports also state he had shaved his mustache off. If this had been the case, Booth thought that when he crossed into Virginia, he would be welcomed as a hero. And since he was practically in Virginia, why would he take the time to disguise himself? After all, having the ego that he had, he probably wanted the people in Virginia to know who he was and to recognize him. Another contentious point in the identification process revolved around the leg injury. When Booth had jumped from the balcony, he had injured his right leg. The man full from the barn had an injured left leg. Frederick Demond was a soldier in the Union Army. He'd been sent to guard one of the many bridges leading out of Washington shortly after Lincoln had been shot. According to a letter that he wrote later in life, all of the bridges out of the city were closed overnight and guarded. On the night of the search for the assassin, Demond's superior officer gave him explicit instructions to allow passage to anyone using the password TB Road. Later that night, a man rode up to him and used the code. Demond thought this was odd because it was the first and only time he had ever received orders like this. John St. Helen lived in Granbury, Texas in the mid-1870s, and in 1877 he became ill and he was convinced that his life was coming to an end. When his attorney and friend, Finis Bates, arrived at his bedside, St. Helen decided to reveal his deepest, darkest secret. He told Bates that his name was actually not John St. Helen. He then said that his name was John Wilks Booth. Bates thought that St. Helen was hallucinating from the fever he was running. St. Helen began telling a detailed confession of how he had escaped from Washington and how he was a part of a conspiracy to first kidnap and then kill Abraham Lincoln. Bates began to believe St. Helen was telling the truth. His friend didn't die after his confession, and he was able to recover. As soon as he was back on his feet, St. Helen left town, without telling anyone. Nothing more was heard about St. Helen for the next quarter of a century. Then, in 1903, a man calling himself David George died after drinking a glass of wine that had been laced with strychnine. When Bates saw a photograph of the body of David George, he recognized it as being his old friend John St. Helen. Bates traveled to Enid, Oklahoma, and he made arrangements to secure the corpse. Bates took extensive photographs of the body and was startled at the strong resemblance between the man he knew as John St. Helen and John Wilks Booth. Bates had the body mummified, intending to prove that the official story was either a lie or a deliberate cover-up. This took a whole long time, but when the body was finally examined 30 years later, 3 injuries that Booth was known to have had were recorded as being found in the body of David George, a.k.a. John St. Helen. This wasn't the only evidence. Facial recognition software was used on images of both John St. Helen and John Wilks Booth. Certain things about a person's face never change. The distance between the eyes, the shape of the skull, the jawline, the cheekbones. A soft tissue will change over time, but not the bones underneath. The computer came out saying there was a very high probability that the images were all of the same person. This, combined with the reports at the scene of the shootout at Garrett's farm that the body wasn't John Wilks Booth, it would seem as if John St. Helen was indeed Booth. This following information comes from the website civilwarbummer.com. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton employed secret agents to collect information and carry out orders not covered by the military. President Lincoln did his best to not micromanage the efforts of his cabinet. Give a person a job, tell them how to do it, give them the tools to do it, and then let them do it. The secretaries were allowed to direct the day-to-day business under their responsibilities. The Lincoln administration maintained no centralized secret service. Each government agency employed their own independent sources of intelligence, and sometimes these stealthy operatives spied on each other. The most powerful man in Lincoln's cabinet was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Today, we would call him a Secretary of Defense. This was changed after World War II. As the Civil War was going on, the Secretary of War developed more power. Being in charge of all of the land forces as well as the Navy, Stanton was allowed to use many assets not in uniform. These were called the Intelligence Service. You could also call them spies. Stanton kept a tight rein on his generals, and if they did not follow his wishes to the letter, they would be banished at some backwater post with a career-ending position. One of the major players by Stanton was when he absorbed one of the major power plays by Stanton was when he absorbed the telegraph service into his War Department. This meant that all communications would be routed directly to one of his minions, and only the information deemed necessary was passed on to Lincoln. Stanton and Lincoln maintained an uneasy alliance. Lincoln was an easygoing and affable person. Stanton was impatient, unstable, and very harsh. Lincoln was the perfect public relations executive, and Stanton an administrative tyrant. That was always right, even when he was wrong. He insisted that his decisions were always correct. Stanton would argue with Lincoln on many occasions, even though Lincoln was his boss. As commander-in-chief, the president was in charge of the military, but Stanton acted as if he was in charge and the president was just there as an advisor. One day, Stanton sharply rebuked Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt for a mission he had undertaken on behalf of the president, saying, "Well, all I have to say is, we've got to get rid of that baboon in the White House." When the story was repeated to the president, Lincoln refused to even consider Stanton's comments as an insult, saying, "This is no insult, and it's an expression of an opinion, And what troubles me most about it is that Stanton said it, and Stanton is usually right. Well, Stanton was usually right because nobody dared argue with him because, well, he was not a man to listen to arguments. All of the central figures in the military and the government had individuals gathering surreptitious information to further their knowledge of the civil conflict. Lincoln had Ward Hill Lamon. General McLean employed Allen Pinkerton, and Stanton utilized the services of Lafayette C. Baker. Lafayette Curry Baker was born October 13, 1826, on a farm located in upstate New York. His family moved to Michigan, where Baker grew up. After a few years of schooling, Baker moved back to New York City, but there is little record of his activities there. Some say he hung out with some of the street gangs, robbing and stealing for a living. In 1849, Baker headed to the gold fields of California looking for fame and fortune. The only people who got rich looking for gold were the folks selling supplies and alcohol to the miners. 1856, Baker made a name for himself as an enforcer for a vigilance committee. Back then, there were no law enforcement. So, to keep the criminals down to a low roar, the locals would hire someone or several people to enforce the laws as they saw fit. Later on, Baker moved to San Francisco and became a bouncer at one of the bigger saloons. He made extra money working as an informer for the local police department. When the Civil War began in 1861, Lafayette Baker moved back to the East Coast, and he received an interview with the Union Commander General Winfield Scott. Baker was hired as an intelligence operative and asked to undertake an espionage mission in Confederate territory. Well, Baker was captured twice. First, by the Union Army. Any man running around the battlefields who wasn't in uniform was suspected of being a spy. Once he managed to secure his release, Baker was then captured by the Confederate Army. Well, once again, Baker managed to talk his way out of custody. He then spent several weeks running around the countryside without ever actually doing anything. Then he made his way back to Washington, where he proceeded to tell General Scott about all of his glorious deeds. All the intelligence he did not have, he just made up. He lied to his boss, and this led to a promotion. Baker was promoted to captain. When Secretary of War Stanton heard about this daring undercover operative, he recruited Baker to be the head of the Union Intelligence Service. Stanton then gave him a job as the head of the National Detective Police. This would explain a lot about Army intelligence. If you were in the Army, you know what I mean. In his new capacity as the head of the National Detectives, Baker operated essentially as the head of the secret police. He was free to investigate anyone and punish any activity he deemed corrupt or rebellious. Most of Baker's time was spent tracking down deserters from the Union Army. He also went after profiteers, but only to line his own pockets. Baker arrested and jailed those who refused to share their illegal spoils from selling government supplies. Baker violated constitutional rights without fear of repercussions since he was Stanton's right-hand man. He routinely made false arrests, conducted illegal searches without warrant, and blackmailed government officials into making endorsements of his almost non-existent espionage service. There were those who said no one misused his authority or office more than Lafayette Baker. He developed a reputation for arresting and punishing suspects without warrant or a semblance of law or justice. One of Baker's successes was the capture of the Confederate spy Belle Boyd. Later, Baker was accused of conducting a brutal interrogation, and despite the inhumane treatment, Boyd refused to confess, and she was finally released in 1863. Baker once unearthed widespread corruption within the Treasury Department. While there was undoubtedly criminal activity, some felt that the only reason it came to light was because Baker didn't get a cut. One Treasury Department official commented, "Baker became a law unto himself. He instituted a veritable reign of terror. He always lived in the finest hotels, and he always had an abundance of money." Baker was eventually caught tapping telegraph lines between Nashville and the office of Stanton. Well, he got demoted and sent to New York and placed under the control of Charles Dana, the Assistant Secretary of War. When Lincoln was assassinated, Baker was summoned by Stanton to Washington with instructions to find the president's assassin. When Lincoln died, Stanton took over the government, declaring martial law. What he wanted more than anything at that moment was John Wilks Booth, offering a $100,000 reward for his capture. Lafayette Baker arrived in Washington April 16th, and his first act was to send his agents to Maryland to pick up what information they could about the people involved in the assassination. Now I wonder why he didn't send the men into Virginia. After all, when Booth jumped off the balcony, he quoted the Virginia motto. Within 2 days, all of the conspirators were in custody. Somehow, Baker knew exactly where he could find the alcoholic George Atzerodt, whose nerves had failed him when it came time to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. There's also a story that says that Johnson may have been in on the plot to kill Lincoln. Baker also knew Seward's would-be assassin, Lewis Payne, could be found in the Washington, D.C. boarding house of Mary Surratt. Colonel Baker knew to arrest Edward Spangler, the carpenter at Ford's Theater. Baker deduced that Spangler had drilled a hole in the door leading to Lincoln's box so that Booth, while standing in the outer hallway, could peer into it and observe the president's location. Lafayette Baker had all the answers within 48 hours, including the escape route taken by John Wilks Booth and David Harold. After conferring with Secretary of War Stanton, Baker called in a cavalry officer, Lieutenant Edward P. Duarte, to his office. Baker told Duarte that he was to take 25 of his best men and go in pursuit of the assassin. Baker informed Duarte he would be in command of this special troop, followed by command from his cousin, Luther Baker, and Colonel Everett Conger. Luther Baker was an enforcer who had carried out several of Lafayette Baker's dirty deeds. Colonel Conger also worked for Baker's intelligence service and was known to go to any lengths for his superior. The detachment rode straight to the Garrett farm, where they found Booth and Harold barricaded in a tobacco barn in the early morning of April 26, 1865. Booth refused to surrender, but he allowed Harold to give up. The barn was set on fire, and Booth was shot despite orders to the contrary. Booth was dragged mortally wounded from the blazing building. A conger searched Booth's body and removed a stub of a candle, a compass, a considerable amount of money, and most importantly, a leather-bound diary. A conger had been ordered to find Booth's diary and hold on to it for Baker. Doherty was ordered to return Harold and Booth's body to Washington. A conger turned Booth's effects over to Lafayette Baker, including the diary. Baker then told Conger that he was to witness the fact that he was going to count the exact number of pages in the diary. Then he studied the diary at great length, making notes. Baker then told Conger that he was to accompany him to visit Secretary Stanton. Both men met the Secretary of War at his home. Conger was there as a witness that Baker turned over all of Booth's effects. It would appear that Baker didn't really trust his former boss. Baker received orders from Stanton regarding the conspirators who were now in custody, which included Payne, Harold, Miss Mary Surratt, Spangler, Dr. Mudd, Samuel B. Arnold, and Michael O'Laughlin. Baker received a large part of the $100,000 reward offered for Booth's capture. He was also promoted to Brigadier General as a reward for his work in bringing the conspirators to justice. On February 8, 1866, Baker was dismissed as the head of the secret police. He claimed President Andrew Johnson had discovered that he was spying on him, which was true, but Baker said Secretary Stanton had ordered him to spy on the president. In January 1867, Baker published his book, History of the Secret Service. In the book, Baker described his role in the capture of the conspirators. He also revealed that the diary he had taken from John Wilks Booth when he had been shot was now missing 18 pages. This information about Booth's diary, appearing to have been tampered with, resulted in Baker being called before a congressional committee that was looking into the assassination of Lincoln. Stanton and the War Department were forced to hand over Booth's diary. When shown the diary by the committee, Baker claimed that someone had cut 18 leaves from it. When Stanton was called before the committee, he said he did not remove any pages from the diary. It was that way when he received it. Speculation grew that the missing pages included the names of people who had financed the conspiracy to kill Lincoln. It was also revealed that Booth had received a large amount of money from a New York-based firm to which Stanton had connections. Baker died in 1868, supposedly from meningitis, 18 months after he had testified before Congress. Some thought he'd been killed by the War Department to silence him. Recently, an atomic absorption spectrum... Oh boy, this word is long. Spectrophotometer. Okay, an atomic absorption device was used to analyze several hairs taken from Baker's head. Ray Neff, a professor at Indiana State University, determined that Baker was killed by arsenic poisoning rather than meningitis. Baker had been unknowingly consuming the poison for months, mixed into beer, which was provided by his wife's brother, Wally Pollock. Baker's wife had kept a diary in which she wrote down several dates that Pollock had visited and brought Baker some beer. These dates corresponded to the gradual elevated levels of toxin in Baker's hair samples studied by Professor Neff. It turned out that Pollock worked for the War Department, but nobody could prove he was acting on orders from Secretary Stanton. If I had to guess, I would say there was enough there to warrant an investigation, if not for the fact that this all took place so long ago. I was going to include the information that during the Civil War, towards the end, a Confederate soldier who was being held in the Washington area had been identified as looking an awful lot like John Wilkes Booth. As Secretary of War Stanton had this prisoner brought to him for some unknown reason, and then the soldier had never been seen again from that day. Well, I searched and I searched for the information that I just passed on, and I couldn't find it referenced anywhere. But I do recall hearing it from another source. Oh, there goes my timer. So, I'll just say that there was a story out there about this Confederate soldier who looked like John Wilkes Booth and who did get summoned to Secretary Stanton's office, but I can't find any further information on it, so I'll just have to leave it at that. Hours before shooting Lincoln, Booth had called on Johnson at the Kirkwood house and left a handwritten calling card that read, "Don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home? J. Wilkes Booth." The First Lady, Mary Todd Lincoln, wrote to a friend of hers saying, "That miserable inebriate Johnson had cognizance of my husband's death. Why was that card of Booth's found in his box? Some acquaintance certainly existed." You might say yes, but the vice president was supposed to also be killed. Well, look who was sent to do the deed. Azerrad had been born in Germany but moved to the United States at the age of 8. He could barely speak English, and he was known to drink a lot. He'd taken a room at the same hotel as the vice president, but wound up staying at the bar all night, getting so drunk he may have spilled the beans on what was to come. There's no record of anyone actually having seen the vice president in the boarding house the night of Lincoln's attack. And why did John Wilkes Booth go by to see him just hours before shooting Lincoln? Booth asked at the desk if the vice president was in. When told no, he left the card and then exited the building. Why didn't he let Azerrad know that the man was not there that he was supposed to kill? Instead, he just left the German to waste his time at the bar. Oddly enough, Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson were both disliked by their presidents. They both had a reputation for drinking way too much and way too often. It wasn't until February 10th, 1967, that the 25th Amendment to the Constitution said if the president was to die, the vice president would become president. Before this amendment, the vice president took on the duties of the president, but was only an acting president. It wasn't until after Kennedy was killed that Congress got around to passing an actual law saying who was to move up in case of a death in the White House. This could take some of the suspicion away from Andrew Johnson and explain away Lyndon Johnson's refusal to leave Dallas until he was sworn in as the president. Congress just might have put somebody else in the White House. When John T. Ford attempted to reopen Ford's Theater to a performance for July 10, 1865, Secretary of War Stanton, who was opposed to its ever being again used as a place of public amusement, dispatched heavily armed soldiers to prevent the show from going on. The federal government eventually purchased Ford's Theater for $100,000. The building was gutted, removing anything that was used as a theater. It was then converted into offices to be used by the War Department. June 9, 1893, at the precise moment when funeral services for John Wilks Booth's older brother Edwin began inside the New York Church of the Transfiguration, 3 floors of the Ford's Theater collapsed into the basement and killed 22 federal workers. I do not believe in coincidences. Then there's the international bankers to look at. John Wilks Booth was hired by the Rothschild banking conglomerate to kill Lincoln because, to begin with, he refused to take out loans from the Rothschilds bank at high interest. Then, as the war was coming to an end, Lincoln was going to go easy on the South, allowing them to get back on their feet without having to borrow money to rebuild. Once more, the Rothschilds wanted to be the ones handing out money and then collecting the fees. In its simplest terms, the theory is that Lincoln needed money to finance the Civil War. Banks in Europe, led by the Rothschild, offered him loans at high interest rates. Rather than accepting the loans, Lincoln found other means to fund the war effort. More importantly, the British bankers opposed Lincoln's protectionist policy. The Rothschilds' international plot to kill Lincoln was published October 29, 1976 by New Solidarity Books. Now, this is just a theory, but it's worth looking into. I still discount the vice president in the killing of Lincoln. I don't know who keeps calling every time I'm doing a show. I think somebody in the neighborhood is watching me with binoculars, and they're, oh, he's on the radio, quick call. No, that's just me being paranoid. Actually, it's somebody wanting me to, A, contribute some money to some nonprofit organization that is actually making a profit. For example, I keep getting calls from the Police Benevolent Society, which has absolutely nothing to actually do with the police. It's just a private organization because they can use any name they want. They want me to give them money, and I always ask them to give me money instead, and then they hang up on me. Or it's that prince from Ethiopia trying to give me that $6 million that my long-lost relative left me. God, I hope that's not real. Anyway, I still discount the vice president in the killing of Lincoln. He might have known what was coming, but I doubt he was in on it. If I had to point a finger, I'd say Secretary of War Stanton looks very good. If this had been a fictional novel, the MacGuffin would have led to Stanton. A MacGuffin is an object, event, or character in a film or story that serves to set and keep the plot in motion despite usually lacking intrinsic importance. As John Wilkes Booth lies dying, Harold would ask, "Yes, but what about Stanton?" and all the soldiers would have rode to Washington. But this is not fiction. Someone shot Lincoln and may have gotten away with it. Don't you just hate it when you think you know what's going on only to find that the facts can lead on a weird path into something you never expected? People can thump their fists on the table and say, John Booth killed Lincoln and that's that. These are the same people that believe Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy. You might never know if John Wilkes Booth was just some crazy guy with issues or if he was working with others to change the direction the country was about to go at the end of the Civil War. I hope you enjoyed the show. It was fun and confusing to do all of the research. You can find the archives on YouTube. You can also find the last 100 shows or so on strangethings.podomatic.com. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, the same murder three? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
That was backwards. It's Strange Things with Chris James, but oh well.